Professor Iain Stewart. You may recognise him from the telly, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, so he's the man who does rocks on the television. Sorry, Iain, I could have built it up a bit more than that, couldn't I? But ladies and gents, please put your hands together for the wonderful Iain Stewart. He's going to come off mute. Don't worry, ladies and gentlemen, he will come off mute and we'll be able to hear him as well. There he is, he's finding it.
I'm only a professor of communication and I can't press my mute button. Yeah, thanks for that. It's been great sitting in on this today. It's kind of like a support group for people, flotsam and jetsam of the mining world scattered around, where we all say how, no, it is important. It's been fascinating to listen to the discussions in different aspects. My interest is, as you said, Sarah, on how we communicate technical knowledge to non-technical audience, so specialists to non-specialists, scientists to non-scientists. And I guess where I'm in relation to you guys is I'm upstream. So I'm in the universities, and my interest is how we train the next kind of generation, the people that are coming down, going to be working in the industry, about how we communicate. And, you know, I think it's come up several times that maybe we think that in the past we haven't done such a good job. And we, for a lot of people, the issue of communication is such a fundamental one that it seems to be a real asperity in much of the things that we do. So I'm just going to, I've got a couple of slides just to offer up a provocation, really. Maybe Sarah, you can tell us if you can see this full screen.
Yep, it looks beautiful. Thanks.
Fantastic. So I'm interested in how we communicate what we know to those that we want to try to influence. And so I'm going to explain these three horizons in a few minutes. But behind me is the Salar de Uyuni up in the Bolivian Altiplano, which is, it's got to be one of the most beautiful places in the planet, really. This is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But the reason why it's important, as everyone on this platform will know, is because it's also home to 30%, maybe of that region's 30% of the world's lithium reserves. And as we go for the energy transition, we move to the low carbon future in electric vehicles, and that light mineral metal lithium is going to be increasingly important. And so, you know, society is going to face really quite considerable questions and debates really in the coming years about where it gets its energy and its materials from. As someone said, you know, any future that's got less carbon in it has got a hell of a lot more mining in it. And I don't think most people have appreciated that. Most people out in the street really have appreciated that. So the question then is, how do we communicate some of these issues? And it's probably worthwhile just stepping back a little bit to think, well, how have we approached this problem from an academic point of view? And I've tried to summarize this in this diagram here. So it really shows on the vertical axis, it's what's the motivation of specialists or a scientist. So down the bottom, it's pursuit of knowledge, it's pure academic interest, curiosity, serendipity. And at the top, it's driven by specific problems given to it by society. And then along the vertical axis is the extent to which the public is actually invited into the process. So very low over on the left-hand side to high on the right. So in that bottom left corner is this space which is where the academics live. And so there's what we refer to that as the public understanding of science sector. And in that sector, we've got scientists who decide what they want to get knowledge about. It's a knowledge production area where it's driven entirely internally by the internal interests of the academics. They create this knowledge, and then the expectation is twofold. One is that the benefits of that knowledge will trickle down somehow magically into wider society. And then the assumption that underpins that public understanding of science model is that the reason the public don't agree with the experts, the specialists, is because they just don't have the same information. So that if you provide that information to them, then everything will be fine, and the public will see the world the same way as the experts do. The only trouble with that is it's found to be completely not fit for purpose in many of the applied nature of it. And so public communication, or science communication, switched, or had a new model that emerged really in the 90s called public engagement, which was about dialogue, which said, look, let's forget about educating the public. Let's just invite them into science. Let's get them think that science is cool, and we'll get them in. So I'm a geologist, so it's all about dinosaurs and volcanoes and things like that. Let's get them interested in this. And as kind of Sarah's alluded to, I've kind of made a 15, 20-year career really of that kind of stuff. But the problem is that again is really driven by really us and trying to think about what the public are interested in now. And many of the issues that we deal with are really complicated, and they're not easy to just be simply translated. The other thing that's really come out in, I guess, the last 20, 30 years is the full understanding from, admittedly, the human sciences, psychology, sociology, anthropology, of how people make decisions and take information on board or don't take information on board. So this just summarizes some of those heuristics. These situations that they find themselves in when they're making decisions are often time poor, got to act fast, massive amounts of data out there, much of the data is uncertain, and there's usually a lot of fear and emotion. And so as a result of that, the process they go through is one where when the information is complex, they base it on their gut instinct, their values and beliefs. They'll really then look to confirm their values by finding information that tells them they've made the right kind of fast thinking decision. And the shortcut, cognitive shortcut, that is trust. So finding people that they trust and that share some values. And that doesn't, of course, have to be experts. In fact, often it's not the experts, because they come from a different world and they don't get trusted. It's their friends, it's their family, it's their influencers, it's media influencers, etc. And so the net problem that we have is the fact that, that decisions really that are, opinions that aren't formed by logic or facts, aren't influenced by logical factual arguments. And that's a real problem for us, because in our technical training, we emphasize logical factual arguments above more or less everything else. In other words, if we can create things as a logical factual arguments, then surely that is what is going to compel people. But the evidence out there, the empirical evidence, suggests that there's a whole bunch of other things that really determine whether people accept information or not. And there's a whole set of nested decision-making areas really that influence that. So for me, one of the fundamental things was that's changed really was in 2015. So 2015 is the Paris Climate Agreement. It was in December, but before that, in June was the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and in September was the Global Sustainable Development Goals. So these are three global frameworks where society sets out a very specific roadmap for science and technology to deliver on for a better, more equitable world. And that's really caused quite a lot of debate really within science about this kind of model, because it's to say that this is a version of the similar one that I showed before, but we down in the bottom left, we've got standard science, mode 1 science driven by academics. Then there's some science that's maybe inspired by what users want, and then pure applied. But a new world had opened up really, the world of what's called co-production, so with stakeholders, and social learning. So actually it's undertaking learning not in the academic context, but actually in the social context. And this is all referred to as kind of post-normal science or transformative science. But what's hard about all of this is to try and work out what we actually do. How does that then translate into what people teach, what we teach, and also how we deal with communication. So my contention, or my provocation really, is to see three communication fields that essentially build on each of them and become more sophisticated. So the academic side, the academic core, is what I refer to as make and sell. What that is basically that science and universities and academics, and professionals, we generate knowledge. It's not been asked, that specific knowledge hasn't been asked for by the public. We've internally generated, we decided we want to have this, and then we sell it out the door. And we do that by draping it in lots of journalistic, use journalistic skills to write really compelling narratives. We got amazing imagery, but we are selling it to a public that essentially paid for it through their taxes, but didn't ask for it. So we make it very digestible, and we allow the public to consume this science, but it's very much one way. It's our science that we're asking the public to consume. The next model out is referred to as sense and respond, and that really reflects the fact that there's lots of empirical data there around what actually works and what doesn't work. We get that from psychology and sociology, and I've just touched on it. And so basically what there is to say, look, who's your audience? Understand your audience. If you understand your audience, then you can tailor your communication devices to that. But actually, at the end of the day, all you're still doing is still delivering that message from science to that audience. You're just doing it in a more sophisticated way, more targeted way. So the last one, these are all kind of marketing paradigms from business. The other marketing paradigm that's come along really in the last 20 years is referred to as guide and co-create. And this is the area, and it's been mentioned earlier on today, ethical marketing, social marketing, whereby the guide part is a sense of long-term leadership, a direction of travel that a company, that a business decides to take, but recognizes that in order to get there, it has to take the customer base with it. It has to co-create the narrative, the journey with their customer base. And we've already heard what the driving force of that is. I heard it earlier on about purpose. And so these are purpose-led organizations. Now, what's interesting, I think, in this is that the skill set, communication skill set in a guide and co-create model is very different to the communication skill set in make and sell. So in guide and co-create, it's around truly interdisciplinary thinking, blurring all of the interdisciplinary, it's really transdisciplinary. It's been genuinely participatory about lots of different voices inside. It's about being reflexive. It's about skills of negotiation, conciliation, because it's about dialogue and discussion. So in trying to look at this, then, this is a much more nuanced and layered set of communication skills that I think we need to be conveying to the professionals that come through our system. And I put this, I think we went back. I put this up. This was something that 3 Horizons, which John Elkington has showed at a conference recently, and John's allowed us to do this. This is the 3 Horizons that look, basically the 3 Horizons are horizons that sit in the present, but project towards the future. So the one at the top, which is Horizon 1, is business as usual. It's how we are now. So if you look at that there, it's the world of shareholders, it's dependent on fossil fuel, GDP growth is king, and the result of that is inequality of wealth and many of the issues that we've been talking about. The orange line is the horizon, which is emerging, and it's an entrepreneurial space for people who understand the limitations or appreciate that there are limitations with business as usual, and so are trying to innovate into a new space. And you can see things about new technologies, new accounting frameworks, ESG becoming mainstream kicks in there. But underpinning that is the new paradigm that's coming in, that's going to sweep in, the one that's going to transform it and overtake and become the next prevailing paradigm. And that Horizon 3 is the visionary space, and it's things that are just seen at the moment as weak signals. So the well-being economy, for example, that certain governments, Finland, Iceland, Scotland, New Zealand, and Wales, have started to look at in terms of legislative. But it's also things like the social movements that are starting to build around social inequity, and things like Black Lives Matter and the climate strikes. So the interest then is the entrepreneurial space can go either way. It can get co-opted and brought back into the managerial space of business as usual to allow what's happening now to sustain itself a little bit, or it could be deviated into this new emergent paradigm and help accelerate through the new world that's essentially coming, essentially the world of the SDGs and on well-being. So I just put this out because what I'm interested in is how the way we communicate, the skill sets that we think around fit with that. So to my mind, 95% of the science communication that comes out of universities and research organizations is make and sell. They're trying to sustain business as usual through lots of imaginative, creative thinking, but actually It's really one-dimensional. We can learn to do sense and respond. We can learn to be smarter about working out what people want, and that will carry us on for a little bit longer. But ultimately, that will probably just help sustain, make, and sell. The challenge is going to be how we start to inculcate the skills of guide and co-creation into the kind of new sets of professionals coming through. And for that, I think one of the things that is required is essentially that universities have to become purpose-led organizations. And so I think with that contention, I'll stop.
That was one hell of a note to stop on there, Iain, in terms of rescoping universities. But a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for fantastic Iain Stewart. That was absolutely brilliant, Iain.
Thanks,
and I have to confess as well, so during your talk, I have just bought Green Swans in terms of that book that only came out last month, because that looks fantastic. Iain, just on that, in terms of that move towards the guide and co-create, do you have any hints, tips, or resources, for example, that we can take a look at that would help us better understand what that really means, or how to be able to move into that space more?
I think there's a few emergent areas. I mean, it's a dialogic space. And so a lot of the work that happens in terms of genuinely community dialogue. So the trouble with a lot of the dialogic work I think that happens at the moment in the mining space is that it's kind of instrumentalized listening. So it's a set of listening that's put out there, but actually the people doing the listening aren't really interested in what's coming back. They're interested in finding out what problems are so they can target their messaging better. So we need to create a better listening environment, and that seems at first glance to be very much against the whole thing about communication, which is how do you get your stuff out there. So I think there are things that are doing it. I've been really impressed with. Was involved in the Scottish Climate Assembly. I was the communications lead there, and that was really interesting watching 100 normal everyday people, demographically representative, so actually in part of that also represented about how they felt about climate change. So some think it's complete rubbish, tax dodge, some people absolutely fired up, and most people just in the messy middle. But let's watching 100 people over the course of 6 weekends work through the information and increase the deliberative space that they had to talk through this thing and come out with, in the end, a whole suite of really quite radical actions, far more radical than the Scottish government has got at the moment. So the Scottish government will have to come back to that. One of them, for example, is encouraging the Scottish government to move away from GDP as a metric of success into well-being. So I think that my confidence is that we've got mechanisms that we can use this, but we just haven't developed them to any great degree.
Okay, and I mean, that's something where, just to signpost some of the talks that are coming on later in the week. So I think everything you've just described, Iain, is fantastic. And there are actually quite a lot of tools and techniques, and I'm looking at Susan here, that have been coming from the sort of the social space in terms of how do you create those dialogue tables, or those that sort of ecosystem in which people can co-create in a way and discover together. And so therefore perhaps all feel they have ownership in terms of what's being driven forwards. So I don't know, I think there's some really nice kind of cross learning between these different avenues here, which is fantastic. So Iain, I'm going to keep you on the line because we're about to go into our panel session. But before we do that, ladies and gents, please put your hands together for the fabulous Iain Stewart.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iain. That was great.